I never thought I'd end up working in a place like this. When I was younger, I imagined my life would go in a dozen different directions. College, maybe the military, maybe just drifting until I found something that made sense. But somewhere between debt piling up, relationships falling apart, and bills showing up faster than paychecks, the future narrowed into a single question: what job will keep me alive for another month? That's how I found the listing. It was buried on a local government job board, half finished and vague. The description read like it had been translated badly. Remote power maintenance position, monitoring grid stability, requires resilience, attention to detail, and solitude tolerance. Housing provided. Substantial pay. The pay caught my attention. It was more than anything I'd ever made before. Enough to drag me out of debt in a year if I kept it. Enough to disappear if I wanted to. I didn't ask myself why the company was willing to throw that much money at someone with no degree and no real experience. I didn't wonder why the job had been sitting there for weeks with no applicants. All I saw was a way out. The application was short, almost unnervingly so. No interview, just a phone call with a man whose voice was steady and low. He asked me one question: "Can you be alone?" And when I said yes, he gave me the job. I should have asked more, but desperation makes you blind, and at the time, I didn't want to see. The trip out here took most of a day. The highway turned into 2-lane roads, then dirt tracks. My phone lost service somewhere between the last gas station and the first ridge of black pines. The GPS stuttered and froze, and from then on, I followed only hand-scribbled directions sent to me in an envelope with the company's letterhead. By the time I reached the outer perimeter of the grid, the sun was melting down behind the trees. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wires stretched across the horizon like veins. They buzzed faintly, and every so often, a spark cracked the air, even though there were no storms. Something about them unsettled me. They didn't look like ordinary power lines. They sagged and bent in unnatural ways, as if something heavy had dragged across them in the night. I told myself it was just poor maintenance. That was my job now, after all. But then I noticed something else. At the base of one of the poles was a patch of earth scorched black. The ground was cracked, brittle, as if lightning had struck there, except there were no burn marks on the pole itself. No broken glass, no splintered wood, just the smell of metal and ozone, sharp enough to make my teeth ache. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it until a noise drifted across the field. It was faint, a whisper at first, almost like wind curling between wires, but the longer I listened, the more it sharpened into something else, like breathing, slow, steady, exhaling through unseen lungs. I shook it off and told myself I was imagining things. By the time I reached the cabin provided for me, the so-called housing, the sky was black. The building was small, 1 story, and built more like a storm shelter than a home. A concrete shell with 1 narrow window and a heavy steel door. Inside was sparse: a bed, a desk, a tiny kitchen, and a shortwave radio bolted to the wall. Next to the radio was a folder with the company's logo stamped on the front. My name was written across it in block letters. I hesitated before opening it. There was a weight in the air, the same kind I used to feel before opening final notices from the bank. The sense that whatever was inside would change things. And I was right, because inside that folder was the first thing that made me realize this wasn't just another job. It was a list, and it was titled Rules for Grid Operators. The folder felt heavier than paper should. I sat down on the narrow bed, the radio humming faintly in the background, and opened to the first page. There were no instructions about power usage, safety harnesses, or repair manuals like I expected. Instead, the document was a list typed in the same stiff language as the job description. 7 rules, each one stranger than the last. I read them once, then again, thinking maybe fatigue was making me misinterpret them. but no matter how I read them, they made no sense. Rules for grid OPR hours: never go outside after midnight. The wires hum differently at night. Stay inside until daylight, no matter what you hear. Do not touch the wires directly. Even if they look dead, they aren't. Sometimes they only pretend to be. If the lights in the cabin flicker 3 times in a row, shut off the radio immediately. Do not turn it back on until morning. Do not acknowledge anyone calling your name from outside the cabin after dark. No one should be there. If you see movement on the wires, do not investigate. Stay inside and record the time in the logbook. Never, under any circumstances, cut power to the grid entirely. It must stay alive. If you wake up and find the cabin door unlocked, do not step outside. Wait, someone will come to relock it. Do not open the door for them. The rules had no explanation, no context, just typed numbers, commands, and silence between the lines. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the page. I kept trying to rationalize them. Maybe they were safety exaggerations warnings written by someone paranoid about liability, but the way they were written felt wrong. Not like a corporate checklist, but like superstition. I was still processing when a knock rattled the steel door. The sound jolted me so hard, I nearly dropped the folder. My first thought was the last rule. Don't open the door if someone comes to lock it. But it was still early, just past 10. I forced myself to stand and crack the door. A man stood outside, lantern light spilling across his face. He was tall, older, weathered. His jacket bore the company patch, but his eyes were what caught me sharp tired, like they'd seen too much. "You're the new operator?" he asked. I nodded. He gave a small grunt, stepped past me into the cabin without waiting for an invitation, and scanned the room. His gaze landed on the folder in my hands. "You've read them?" I hesitated. "The rules?" "Yeah, I don't really good." He cut me off sharply, as though nothing else mattered. "You follow them, you'll be fine. Break them, you won't last the week." The way he said it froze me. No smile, no trace of humor, just flat certainty. I tried to laugh it off. "They're a little unusual, like the one about don't joke about them." His voice hardened. "That's how people slip. They laugh, they ignore, they think they know better, and then I have to haul what's left of them out from under the poles." His words hung heavy in the air. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the faint hum vibrating through the floorboards, like the wires outside were alive beneath the earth. "Who are you?" I asked. "Foreman. Name's Keller." I handled the transitions. He studied me for a moment. "You'll be here 3 months. If you make it, you rotate out. Simple." I wanted to ask, make it against what? But the weight in his voice stopped me. Instead, I asked, "What happens if I need help?" He tapped the radio, bolted to the wall. "That's a direct line to me. Don't use it unless it's an emergency. And if the lights flicker 3 times," his jaw tightened, "you know what to do." I glanced at the bare bulb above us, half expecting it to flicker right then. It did in single quotes too. Keller left soon after. No goodbye, no instructions about actual grid maintenance, just a warning to walk the perimeter at dawn, and a look in his eyes that told me he wanted to say more, but wouldn't. That night I lay awake on the thin mattress, listening. The cabin was silent, but outside the wires hummed. I thought it would be like white noise, easy to tune out. Instead, it was restless, changing, swelling like the tide. Sometimes it was faint, almost soothing. Other times it pulsed, a low growl that seemed to vibrate against my ribs. At some point, I drifted close to sleep. That's when I heard it. My name. It was faint, almost drowned beneath the wires. But it was there, drawn out, whispered, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. I shot upright, heart pounding. The steel door stood closed. The window was black dot, and then it came again, clearer this time. My name spoken right outside the cabin. I remembered Rule 4. Do not acknowledge anyone calling your name after dark. I sat frozen on the bed, staring at the door, the rules echoing in my head. My throat felt dry, every instinct screaming to respond, to demand who it was. But something colder held me in place. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Eventually, the voice stopped, and the wires outside went on humming, like they were pleased I had listened. Morning came slow, dripping across the sky in thin streaks of gray. I hadn't slept much. Every creak of the cabin kept me awake. Every swell of the humming outside pressed on my chest like weight. But when light finally filled the single narrow window, the fear eased. Like night had pulled its claws back into the woods. I told myself the voice I'd heard was nothing, a dream, an echo of stress, if I let it crawl too deep into my head. I'd never last the 3 months Keller promised, so I forced myself into motion. The perimeter check, that was the only real task Keller had mentioned. I pulled on boots, a jacket, and stepped outside into cold air that smelled faintly of iron. The forest stretched far in every direction, black pines climbing into fog, and above them, the wires cut across the sky like scars. They looked wrong, up close. They weren't smooth lines of steel. They were twisted, frayed in places, sagging under invisible pressure. When the wind stirred, they didn't sway like normal wires. They trembled, as though something clung to them, unseen. Still, I pushed forward, pole after pole, logbook in hand, recording what I saw. Just routine, just maintenance. By the time I looped back toward the cabin, the sun had risen high enough to burn off the fog. For a while, I almost felt normal, until I broke a rule. It happened near the far edge of the grid, where the lines bent low enough to nearly skim the treetops. I noticed one wire hanging slack, as if it had snapped loose. Instinct took over. I stepped toward it, reaching out. Rule 2. Do not touch the wires directly. I didn't remember until my fingertips brushed the metal. The sensation hit like plunging my hand into ice water. Every nerve fired at once. My vision blurred, white-hot pain lancing up my arm. And beneath the pain was something worse, something alive. It wasn't electricity. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, steady and slow, thudding through the wire into my skin. And with it came images, quick and jagged, stabbing into my brain, flashes of dark shapes writhing along the lines, jaws opening where no faces should be, teeth gnashing on sparks of light. I yanked my hand back, stumbling into the dirt. My palm was unburned, unscarred, but it trembled uncontrollably. The logbook had fallen open beside me, blank pages fluttering in the wind. For a long moment, I just sat there, fighting the urge to vomit. When I looked up, the wire was no longer slack. It was taut, humming, as though nothing had been wrong at all. And then I noticed something moving along. At first, I thought it was a trick of light, but no, the shadow clung to the wire, inching forward in jerks, long and thin like a centipede made of smoke. Every time it crawled, the hum deepened, pressing into my skull. It stopped above me, hung there, quivering. I froze, barely breathing. Then, without sound, it slid further along the line, vanishing into the trees. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was past noon, but I felt colder than when I'd left. I shoved the logbook onto the desk, hands still shaking, and poured water from the tap until the glass overflowed. I told myself I wouldn't write what I'd seen, that it was a hallucination from fatigue, but the words clawed inside me, demanding escape, so I wrote anyway. 11:42 a.m. Touched wire, felt heartbeat, saw movement, shadow shape on line. The act of writing didn't help. If anything, it made the memory heavier, more real. I sat back, staring at the page. When the light above me flickered once, twice, 3 times, my breath hitched. Rule 3. Shut off the radio immediately. The bulb steadied, buzzing faintly. The radio crackled. I stared at it, unmoving, until the static sharpened into something almost like a voice. A low whisper, stretched thin by distance, crawling through the speaker. It wasn't words yet, not clear, but it wanted to be. My hand hovered over the radio's switch. Every part of me screamed to listen, to know what was trying to speak, but Keller's voice echoed in my memory. Don't joke about them. Don't ignore them. That's how people slip. I snapped the switch off. The cabin dropped into silence. For a long moment, I sat in the stillness, hearing only the blood rush in my ears. Then, faintly, outside, the wires began to hum louder, as though something out there had noticed me that night. I dreamed of wires. They stretched endlessly across a black sky, twisting like veins above a dead world. I saw shadows crawling along them, clinging, feeding. Their shapes weren't solid, more like stains smeared across the air. But every time they shifted, I heard the snap of jaws closing. When I woke, the room was silent, except for the faint hum outside. My palms still tingled where I'd touched the line, phantom pulses crawling under the skin. I tried to shake it off. Tried to pretend yesterday had been an accident, just bad nerves, but the rules wouldn't leave my head. They lingered like thorns, sharper each time I replayed them. The second violation came the next evening. I had spent the day making rounds, writing logs, and trying not to stare too long at the wires. Nothing unusual had happened, at least nothing visible, but there was a tension in the air, like waiting for a storm that never arrived. By dusk, I was back in the cabin, staring out the narrow window. The forest outside had grown darker, heavier. The wires cut across the view like taut strings, humming louder than they had the day before. That's when I heard the knock, soft at first, then again, firmer. I froze. The rules. Do not acknowledge anyone calling your name from outside the cabin after dark. But this wasn't a voice, it was knocking. My heart hammered as I stepped closer to the door. The knock came again. Slow, steady, patient. Then a voice followed. It was Keller. Operator, he said, his tone low and flat. It's Keller. Open up. Relief washed over me. He must have come for a check-in. Maybe he'd sensed something was wrong with the lines. I grabbed the handle, then stopped. The rule didn't say anything about knocking, but the memory of Keller's sharp warning came back. Don't joke about them. Don't ignore them. His voice outside the door was calm, but something about it lacked weight, like hearing a recording with all the human edges sanded off. My hand lingered on the handle. Keller, I called. The knocking paused, then the voice repeated, word for word, in the same exact tone. Operator, it's Keller. Open up. My chest went cold. I backed away from the door slowly. The voice spoke again, this time from the window, closer, double quotes, operator, it's Keller. Open up. The curtains trembled, though the window was shut. My reflection in the glass looked pale, sweat running down my temple. I whispered to myself, don't acknowledge. Don't acknowledge. The voice grew distorted, dragging syllables too long. Apian uu. The cabin's bulb flickered once, then steadied. The hum outside grew sharp, rattling the glass. I forced myself to sit on the bed, every muscle shaking, eyes fixed on the steel door. The knocking didn't stop. It went on for hours, sometimes soft, sometimes loud enough to rattle the frame, but I didn't move. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep. When morning came, silence filled the cabin. No voice, no knocking. The air felt thin, brittle, as if whatever had stood outside had finally left. But the door was unlocked. My stomach dropped. Rule 7. If you wake up and find the cabin door unlocked, do not step outside. Wait. Someone will come to relock it. Do not open the door for them. I stared at the bolt, hanging loose. My first thought was that Keller really had come by. Maybe he'd stepped in after I fell asleep, checked on me, and left. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been testing me. I backed away from the door, sat on the bed, and waited. Hours passed. The logbook sat open on the desk, untouched. I tried to distract myself, counting cracks in the concrete ceiling, but the hum outside crawled under everything, constant and alive. It wasn't until late afternoon that I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching against the dirt, then a rattle at the lock, a key turning. The bolt slid back into place with a sharp click. Silence. No knock. No voice. Just retreating footsteps, fading into the trees. I didn't move for a long time after that. When I finally found the courage to look out the window, the wires seemed to vibrate faster, almost gleeful, like they knew I'd passed a second test, or like they were waiting for me to fail the next one. The days blurred after that. Every morning, I walked the perimeter, logging what I saw, avoiding the wires as though they carried venom instead of current. Every night, I locked myself inside the concrete box, staring at the single bulb overhead, waiting for it to flicker. And always, the humming followed me. It was never constant. Sometimes it purred like wind through a tunnel. Other times it scraped, jagged, like teeth grinding on metal. And once, I swear it whispered, half-formed syllables, as if the wires themselves were trying to shape words. By the end of the first week, I was cracking. I needed answers. The cabin had little in the way of comfort, but it had one luxury, a filing cabinet tucked against the far wall. At first I assumed it held company manuals or maps, but one night, when the silence pressed too tight against my skull, I pulled it open. Inside were folders, dozens of them, labeled with operator numbers instead of names. I carried a stack to the desk and flipped one open. What I found wasn't corporate paperwork. It was notes, handwritten logs, journals, sketches, accounts from the people who'd worked here before me. The first folder belonged to someone labeled Operator 21. His handwriting was frantic, jagged. Most entries were short, just dates and single sentences. Saw them again tonight, or they touched the glass this time. But as weeks went on, his entries stretched longer, filled with desperate detail. They aren't shadows. Shadows don't move like that. They feed. I've seen them latch onto the wires and drain the current until sparks rain like blood. Then they scatter, sliding away before daylight. Keller says not to write it down, but if I don't, I'll go mad. He knows more than he says. He's seen what happens when the grid dies. That's why it must stay alive. I dreamed last night of a world without them. The silence was worse. I think we are batteries. The wires keep them fed, and we keep the wires alive. If one breaks, they notice us instead. I closed the folder, hands trembling. Operator 21 hadn't rotated out. His file ended mid-sentence. The next folder belonged to Operator 19. The handwriting was steadier, almost calm, but the words were no less disturbing. The rules keep us from joining them. That's what Keller won't say. The voices outside aren't imitations. They're invitations. Once you answer, you're theirs. I've started to see faces in the wires. Brief, stretched, screaming. They disappear when I blink, but I know they're real. Maybe they're the ones who answered. Maybe the grid doesn't just feed them, it traps what's left of us in the lines. Do not cut power, ever. I don't care what the manual says. Without current, they cross down, and once they're on the ground, nothing stops them. By the time I reached the third folder, my stomach was tight with dread. This one had no number, just a name, scrawled across the tab. Keller. My pulse quickened. Inside were older documents, yellowed paper, brittle edges, handwritten reports that looked decades old. Some pages bore government seals, others just plain letterhead, but all of them told the same story, piece by piece. The grid wasn't ordinary infrastructure. It had been built deliberately, here in the middle of nowhere, not to power homes or cities, but to contain. The first document was a field report from 1963. The anomaly responds to electricity. Lines erected along perimeter successfully divert activity. Though long-term effects remain unknown, recommend continued expansion of containment grid. Another, from 1971, incident report, failure at Node 7 resulted in breach. Casualties? For personnel. Entity observed, feeding directly on biological tissue. Grid restored within 48 minutes. Recommend increasing redundancy. Then one from 1989, civilian infiltration noted. Trespassers absorbed. Recommend perimeter signage and controlled access disguised as power company. Operations. I felt sick. The wires weren't here to deliver power. They were a cage, and I was part of the lock. I shoved the papers back into Keller's folder, hands shaking, when something slipped free from between the pitches of photograph. It showed a man, younger but unmistakably Keller, standing beside a power pole. His face was hard, but his eyes even then. They carried the same weight I'd seen on his first visit. Behind him, just barely visible against the wires, was a shape, blurry, elongated, clinging to the line like a parasite. I stared at it until my skin crawled. Then I shoved it back into the folder and slammed the cabinet shut. The next morning, I found Keller waiting outside the cabin. He didn't knock this time. He just stood there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me as I stepped out. "You've been reading," he said flatly. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. "You weren't supposed to." His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "Those files are for training, when you're ready, not before." My throat felt tight. "Why didn't you just tell me?" He looked past me, toward the wires stretching across the tree line. "Because telling doesn't work. People need to see it themselves, or they don't believe." I wanted to press him, wanted to demand how many operators had died here, how many faces were locked screaming in the wires. But the words stuck. Instead, I asked, "What happens if the grid fails?" Keller's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said quietly, "You don't want to know," and he walked away. That night, I dreamed again. But this time, it wasn't shadows, it was faces. Dozens, maybe hundreds, stretched thin across the lines like fabric. Mouths open and silent screams. Their eyes followed me as I moved, begging, pleading. Some looked fresh, human. Others were nothing but hollows, and all of them hummed, a chorus of static, feeding endlessly, forever bound to the wires. I woke gasping, sweat soaking the sheets. The bulb overhead flickered once, then twice. I lay frozen, staring at it, until it steadied again. The radio crackled faintly in the silence, and through the static. For just a moment, I thought I heard my own voice whisper back at me. It happened during my second week. By then, the routine had set in perimeter walks, log entries, nights of humming and whispers. But the cracks were widening. My sleep was fractured, filled with static and faces that weren't mine. My hands shook whenever I touched the logbook, and always, the rules pressed into my mind, sharp and insistent. That morning started like any other. The forest was damp with mist, the air heavy with the smell of ozone. The wires trembled faintly overhead, as if shivering with anticipation. I logged each pole, each hum, each spark. By noon, I'd nearly convinced myself things were under control. Then I reached node 12. At first, I thought the pole was just damaged. The wood was split down the center, jagged like lightning had torn through it. But when I stepped closer, I saw the truth. Something had chewed on it. The gouges weren't random. They were bites deep, uneven, ripping chunks of wood out like a starving animal tearing into meat. And worse, the wires drooped lower here, sagging as though something heavy had hung from them. My stomach twisted. I wrote a shaky note in the logbook, but as I lowered my pen, the hum around me deepened. It wasn't the steady vibration I'd grown used to. It was irregular, pulsing like a heartbeat. I froze. Somewhere above me, something moved. At first it was just a ripple, sliding along the wire like heat haze. Then it thickened, taking shape. A long, sinuous shadow crept across the line, its body stretching unnaturally thin, limbs unfolding in angles that shouldn't exist. Its head, or what passed for one, hung down, faceless but for a gaping split, lined with jagged sparks that flared like teeth. The hum grew deafening. My knees locked, my breath caught in my throat. The thing crawled closer. Each movement rattled the wire, sending vibrations down into the pole, and then it stopped. It dangled above me, suspended, sparks dripping from its mouth like saliva. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The only word screaming in my skull was run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The shadow dropped. I hit the ground instinctively, rolling as dirt exploded beside me. The thing landed with a sound like tearing metal, its body folding and unfolding at once. Up close, it was worse than I'd imagined. Its limbs were long cables, jointed wrong, twitching as though the bones inside were breaking and reforming every second. The split in its head gaped wider, static pouring out in shrieks that made my vision blur. I scrambled to my feet and ran. Branches tore at my arms as I sprinted through the pines. Behind me, the creature screeched an electric wail that rattled my teeth, and the hum of the wires followed, growing louder, chasing me. Every instinct told me to look back, to know how close it was. I didn't. I just ran. The cabin appeared through the trees like salvation. I threw myself at the door, slammed it shut behind me, and locked the bolt with shaking hands. Silence for one breath. Two. I thought I'd made it. Then the hum rose outside. The walls trembled. The bulb overhead flickered wildly, casting the room into jerking shadows. I pressed my back to the door as something scraped across it, long, deliberate drags of cable-like limbs. Then came the voice, my voice. It spoke from outside, muffled through the steel. "Let me in." I shook my head violently, whispering, "No, no, no, let me in," it repeated, perfectly mimicking the way I sounded when I was desperate. Broken dot, the bolt twitched. Rule 7 thundered in my head. Do not open the door for them. I clutched the lock until my knuckles went white. The scraping grew frantic, metallic claws raking against the frame. The bulb popped overhead, plunging the cabin into darkness, and in that moment, I felt it. The hum wasn't outside anymore. It was inside, vibrating through the floor, through the desk, through my bones. I staggered back, covering my ears, but it did nothing. The sound came from within me, like my veins had become wires strung too tight. My body locked, muscles seizing. Sparks danced across my vision, and then it stopped. Just like that, the hum receded. The bulb flickered back to life, faint and weak, but steady. The door was quiet. When I dared to look, the bolt was still locked. Whatever had been outside was gone. I collapsed onto the bed, shaking so hard I thought my bones might snap. Hours passed before I moved again. When I finally forced myself up, I found the logbook on the desk. The last entry wasn't mine. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. "It can smell weakness. Don't run. Don't listen. It only has power if you give it fear." I stared at the page, my breath shallow. The ink was fresh. Someone or something had written it while I was hiding in the same room. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing's split mouth, sparks dripping like saliva. I felt the vibration in my bones, as if part of me had been rewired. And outside, the wires hummed on, restless, hungrier than before. Keller returned the next morning. I was sitting at the desk, staring at the logbook's newest entry, the one I hadn't written, when the knock came. A normal knock this time, sharp and heavy, the way a person would do it. I opened the door slowly, half expecting the shadow from the wires to be standing there. But it was Keller. Same weathered jacket, Same steady eyes. "You look like hell," he said. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "Did you write in my logbook?" He frowned. "No. Why?" I slid it across the desk. The page was still open to the jagged handwriting. "It can smell weakness. Don't run. Don't listen." Keller studied it for a long moment. Then he shut the book and pushed it back toward me. "Don't let it get in your head." His words were meant to sound steady, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. He recognized the writing. "Who was it?" I pressed. "Another operator?" He didn't answer. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, rubbed his temples, and said quietly, "You weren't supposed to last this long." The room tilted around me. "What?" Keller sighed, shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. "Most people break by now. The rules keep them alive a little longer, but eventually they slip. And when they do, the grid feeds." My throat went dry. "Feeds what?" He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something I hadn't before. Not just weariness, guilt. "You think this place keeps them out," he said, "but that's not the whole truth. The wires don't just contain, they attract. They hold the things here, keep them tethered, keep them hungry. And he gestured between us. We're the bait." The floor seemed to fall out beneath me. "You knew." His silence was confirmation enough. "You sent me here knowing my voice cracked, knowing I'd die." Keller's jaw tightened. "You were already desperate. That's why you applied. They only take people like you, people no one will miss." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. "You could have warned me," I whispered. "And what would you have done?" His voice hardened. "Run told the world. No one would believe you. No one ever does. The grid needs operators, and someone has to do it. Better you than the things getting loose." My hands shook, fury and fear colliding in my chest. "You're no better than them." For the first time, Keller looked away. "Maybe not, but I've kept the grid alive for 30 years. If it fails, the things in the wires won't just haunt this forest. They'll spread. Every line, every city, every streetlight. You think the hum is bad here? Imagine it everywhere." I wanted to argue, to scream, but deep down, I knew he wasn't lying. The betrayal cut deeper because it was wrapped in truth. That night, Keller stayed in the cabin. He sat by the radio, silent, while I lay awake on the bed. I wanted to hate him, wanted to shut my eyes and never hear his voice again. But the steady presence of another human, even a traitor, was enough to keep me from unraveling completely. Around midnight, the bulb flickered once, twice, then steadied. The radio hissed, crackled, then went dead. Keller tensed. "They're testing the lines." I sat up. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the window, jaw clenched, as if waiting for something. And then the voice came. Not from outside this time, from the radio. It wasn't static anymore. It was words. Clear, steady, calm. "Keller," it said, "time to join us." The sound drained the blood from his face. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked afraid. He snapped the radio off, but the voice kept going. Not from the speaker, this time from the wires themselves. Vibrating through the walls, through the air. "Keller," it whispered again, "we're hungry." I turned to him, heart pounding. "What do they want?" He didn't look at me, because he already knew. At dawn, Keller was gone. No sound of the door opening. No footsteps. Just an empty chair where he'd sat all night. The bolt was still locked, and outside, the wires hummed louder than I'd ever heard them. Almost like they were laughing by the time Keller vanished. I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin felt hollow without him, the silence heavier than his betrayal. The rules, the logs, the routines, all of it seemed absurd now. None of it mattered. The thing in the wires didn't want obedience. It wanted me. I packed what little I had, the logbook, a flashlight, a knife I wasn't sure would help against something made of static and shadow. My hands shook the whole time. as though the wires outside could sense what I was planning. Leaving meant breaking the rules, every one of them. But staying meant waiting to be hollowed out, like Keller. Pulled into the hum until there was nothing left. So I chose. I chose to run. The forest swallowed me quickly, its pines crowding together as if to hide me from the sky. But the wires were always there, threading overhead, humming louder the farther I went. They weren't boundaries, they were veins, and I was still inside the body. Every step was agony, my nerves buzzing as if I carried the hum with me. Once, I tripped on a route and lay there in the dirt, trembling, certain the shadow would drop from the wires and finish me. But nothing came, only the steady vibration, taunting, patient. Hours blurred. My watch had died days ago, so I counted my breaths instead. 2,000 before the trees thinned, and then finally saw it. The access road, cracked, weedy, but real. Civilization's edge. Hope surged in my chest, wild and desperate. I staggered toward it, and the hum spiked. The wires above me sagged, shuddering as if under tremendous weight. Sparks spat down like rain, scorching the dirt. And then it came. The shadow spilled from the lines, unfolding in front of me, taller now, wider, its limbs stretching like cables across the road. The split in its head gaped wider, spilling light so bright it seared my eyes. It didn't need to chase me. It blocked the way. Behind me, the forest rattled with smaller movements, shapes sliding along the wires, dropping into the trees. I wasn't facing one anymore. I was facing all of them. Rule 1 echoed in my skull. Never look directly at the wires after dark. But it wasn't dark, and I had no choice. I looked, and I saw them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, slithering along the grid like parasites. Their bodies flickering in and out of reality, mouths gaping, feeding on the current. Each spark along the line wasn't malfunction, it was hunger, and I was the feast. I gripped the knife, absurd as it was, and screamed, not out of bravery, out of raw, helpless terror. The shadow moved first, limbs whipping down like cables. I dove aside, the blade of one tearing a trench in the dirt where I'd stood. Another lash struck my arm, burning like live current, searing flesh. I stumbled, gasping, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. I knew I couldn't fight it, couldn't outrun it, but I still had the logbook. My hand closed around it, flipping pages frantically until I reached the one with the jagged handwriting. Don't run. Don't listen. It only has power if you give it fear. I stared at the words, trembling. Could it be that simple? Could defiance work where the rules had failed? The shadow loomed closer, sparks hissing from its mouth. The hum vibrated through my skull, through my bones, demanding surrender. I dropped the knife, closed my eyes, and went still. The air buzzed around me, a storm of static so dense it felt like drowning. My instincts screamed to flee, to fight, to do anything but stand frozen. But I didn't move, didn't listen, didn't feed it. The hum reached a peak so loud, I thought my eardrums would burst, then faltered. The air grew lighter, the static thinned, and when I opened my eyes, the shadow was retreating. Its limbs curled back into the wires, its split mouth snapping shut. Sparks fizzled out one by one. The hum softened, returning to its steady, background drone. They weren't gone. Not really. But they'd let me go. For now. I stumbled onto the road, half expecting the shadows to drag me back. But nothing came. For the first time in weeks, the wires above me were empty, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise, because I knew what it meant. They hadn't stopped feeding. They'd just found something better. The road stretched endlessly, gray and broken beneath my feet. I don't remember walking, just one step, then another, as though the wires were still guiding me. Eventually, a car appeared, a rusted pickup, crawling along the road like it had no business being out here. I waved frantically, my throat too raw to shout. The driver stopped. A man in a reflective vest leaned out the window, frowning. "You one of the grid boys?" I nodded weakly. He glanced up at the wires above us, then back at me. "Thought so? You're not the first I've seen wandering off. Usually they don't make it this far." His words chilled me more than the shadow ever had. "Where do they go?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The man's frown deepened. He didn't answer. Instead, he unlocked the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you back." Double quotes back. The word rang in my skull like a death knell. I stepped back from the truck, shaking my head. "No, I'm done. I'm leaving this place." The man sighed, almost pitying. "Son, you think you can just walk away? The wires don't let go. Never have. Never will." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Best thing you can do is follow the rules. That's how you last." My stomach turned, because on the seat beside him, I saw a logbook, identical to mine. The same black cover, the same lined pages, the same faint scorch marks at the edges. I slammed the door and backed away. The man watched me, eyes calm, almost rehearsed. "You'll be back," he said. Then he drove off, the truck vanishing down the road as if swallowed by the mist. I should have kept walking, should have forced myself to follow the road until it led me somewhere else. But the silence pressed too heavy. The hum was gone, yet I could still feel it under my skin, coiled in my veins. The farther I got, the stronger the pull became, dragging me back toward the tree line, and then I realized the truth. The rules weren't just instructions, they were chains. Every operator who came before me had tried to escape. Keller, the man in the truck, whoever wrote in my logbook, and every one of them had been dragged back, caught in the endless loop of the hum. You don't leave the grid, you just keep walking. It's lines until you vanish. I'm writing this now from the cabin again. The logbook is open on the desk, my handwriting filling its latest page. The bulb hums overhead, steady, faithful. Outside, the wires tremble with hunger, and in the corner of the page, I've written a new rule. Don't believe you ever left, because the truth is, I never did.